Hey Jammers, so recently there was an interview with Yoshi-P, the producer and director of Final Fantasy XIV, and one of the big things that's being taken away, and largely because it's the headline, is that without World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV's recovery wouldn't have been possible. I think that, of course, this is a big, headline type line that, came from this interview. But I think that there's some stuff in here that's more important than that. And I think that that line is more to grab your attention. But I think the actual meat of this interview, and I think the most important part, is kind of getting glossed over. So I kind of want to go over this interview with you guys, talk through it, and, my general reactions to what's going on. So, of course, at the beginning, we have the quote with some lovely art here. We're just going to read through this here until we get to a point where I kind of want to react to it. So like many of today's MMORPG monoliths, Final Fantasy XIV is barely recognizable compared to how it looked and played at launch. However, even by MMO standards, few games have undergone a transformation as drastic and important as Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was a critical disaster, prompting an official apology from developer Square Enix and standing in infamy as the rockiest launch in the series' history. After replacing the development team, Square Enix relaunched the game as Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn to commercial and critical acclaim. This success has primarily been attributed to one man, director and producer Naoki Yoshida, or Yoshi-P to his fans, and that's how I'm going to refer to him in the rest of this interview. But what does it take to craft one of the best MMOs of the moment? With A Realm Reborn now in its 8th year and its eagerly anticipated 4th expansion Endwalker coming out in November, we spoke to Yoshi-P about the history of the MMORPG genre, changing player attitudes, and his storied relationship with competitors like World of Warcraft. The past year has seen player numbers boosted as a result of people staying home during the global pandemic. How do you plan to keep this new generation of fans hooked? Yes, a number of new players started their adventures in Final Fantasy XIV, and we've continued to reach new peaks in terms of our active players. However, in the operations team, we've decided to refrain from any proactive PR campaigns during the pandemic and have intentionally been waiting for the situation to ease. I didn't want our players and supporters to feel as though we're taking advantage of the situation as a business opportunity while the world faces the danger of the pandemic. We canceled several campaigns, held back on PR activity, and placed full priority on our patch releases. Despite that, many of our players came together in-game to enjoy Final Fantasy XIV exactly because of its stay-at-home nature. I felt that it brought the relationships we've built with our players over the past 10 years into the spotlight. I want to create opportunities for our newcomers to join in too, and show them not just how fun the game is, but to share the joy of Final Fantasy XIV. MMORPGs today look very different to classics like Age of Ultima and EverQuest. Looking at Final Fantasy XIV as well as your competitors, how has the MMO genre had to adapt and innovate to capture changing players' interests and attitudes? I think the only MMORPGs that could be considered equal to Ultima Online would probably be Lineage and EVE Online, but in my personal opinion, there hasn't been a role-playing experience that surpassed the original Ultima Online. These works have a special place within the MMORPG genre, and there's still demand for them even now, but that demand is by no means great enough to support a large-scale MMORPG project because they need a lot of role-play skill to play effectively. If we could prepare a profitable business model, I'd love to take on the challenge of developing such a game. EverQuest is another masterpiece of the first generation of MMORPGs. It's an incredible game that combined a subscription-based business model with a time-to-win game design, but it was World of Warcraft that faced EverQuest head-on and provided a new way to play. It wasn't based on time to win, but WoW incorporated an item-level system while keeping player skill at its core. Players who invested lots of time could coexist with players who didn't, encouraging a free style of play. As for the evolving genre, I believe it's easy for MMORPGs to accept and reflect changes in gamer lifestyle. If you look back about 20 years, were our lives as busy as they are today? There was the internet, but correspondence was limited to email, real-time communication was limited to PC Messenger clients. Nowadays, you and I have smartphones in the palms of our hands. We have access to entertainment whenever we have a free moment. It goes without saying that there's a dramatic drop in the amount of time players have available after eating, sleeping, working, and spending time with their family and friends. The game design of Ultima Online and EverQuest are still shining jewels even today, and I've no doubt that there's demand for these titles. It's just that it's now more difficult to make those games succeed as a major business undertaking. As a result, game design needs to change and innovate to ensure it matches more closely with MMORPG gamers. For Final Fantasy XIV, we'd like to remain receptive to changes in the lifestyles of our players, and will continue to adjust the design little by little accordingly. Oh boy, that was a whole lot of information there, but that pretty much encompasses what I want to talk about at the beginning here, especially that last question, because he's entirely right. There has been a huge need for evolution in the MMO genre. If you look back to when, I mean, MMO started long before this point, but because World of Warcraft is a giant comparison point in this interview, I'm going to jump back to that point. In the mid-2000s, we were starting to get to the point where social media was really a thing. I think back at that point, it was probably like the MySpace heyday. This was probably right before Facebook really took off. I think Twitter was maybe only a couple years from starting out. Back then it might have even started out, but it was not the Twitter that we know today. Email was definitely a thing, but back when I was a kid, I wasn't using email. We were using AIM back then and other instant messaging programs, but the communication was not primarily based on talking to people, cross state, cross country, cross world even. It was all local communication, something you could just kind of talk with your friends with at night when you had nothing to do. And so when you bring in a game like World of Warcraft, the idea was to have players communicate with each other, right? I mean, back then this was a whole new thing, talking to people on the internet. This was not the norm. Back then you had remember when people used to say oh, you're talking to someone on the internet? How do you know they're not a creeper? And okay, that's still the case today. But now it's you go on dating sites all the time and you're like, oh, you met someone online? Cool. That's a pretty easy way to do it. And it's there's a whole different tone nowadays because it's more normal than it was back then to talk to people on the internet. So MMOs open this up for people to talk with other players around the world and communicate. And, back then you had to, if you were looking for a group for a dungeon or raid, you had to actively walk around cities and try and find people. Or, when I played RuneScape, you would have to go into banks and spam looking to buy rune plate body, this amount of money, and you'd have to actually interact with people. But nowadays you just kind of go around, you're like, oh, LFR, yep, ding, here we go, cool, I need a new sword, let's go to the market board, let's check this out. And there's almost no real need for player interaction. Of course, you still have players with you, but there's no real incentive to really talk to anyone or communicate with anyone. And if you do, most likely you're doing it through a third party program, whether that be Discord or I don't even, do people use TeamSpeak anymore? But these types of programs, these social media, Twitter and all that kind of stuff, it's all out of game, right? When MMOs first started, it was intended to be in game. And now that there's this dynamic shift, you kind of have to change the way that your game works, right? That was a symptom of creating these, LFR systems, the dungeon queues, the market boards. All this was the cause, and the symptom was losing out on these communication. So the MMO had to change. And how did Final Fantasy decide to do it? Well, we are going to get into that shortly. But for now, let's move on with the interview. Final Fantasy XIV is 8 years old, and many of your competitors are even older. What gives a good MMORPG such staying power? Battle content, systems, story, and the game's universe must be both engrossing and expertly crafted. But I think the secret to maintaining game success is the support of a brilliant community. Developers should provide the player with a sense that they are really living in that world and that they belong there, helping them feel at home when they log into the game. Of course, this is based on the assumption that the core development team is playing the game privately, like the general player base. If they didn't, they wouldn't be able to understand player feedback, and at some point or the other, they'd end up as the enemies for the community's perspective. This is something that I feel that some of you MMO players out there are going to feel, especially of those who like Blizzard games. So full disclosure, I haven't played World of Warcraft in a while. I think the last time I played it was during Mists of Pandaria, and I think I played for a year and a half maybe. So I do have some World of Warcraft experience, just not a whole lot, and certainly not compared to a lot of other long-standing players. But from what I've been hearing recently, I still keep up with the game. I watch some Asmongold videos, some Bellular, some Preach, and kind of, watch their interviews and such. There's just one with Venruki about PvP. So I kind of keep up because I'm interested to see, what's going on with the game. And one of the things that it seems like is a big problem right now is that the developers don't fully understand the problems that players are having. And I think a big cause of that is it doesn't feel like they play their own game, because if they did, they would understand why these things are a problem. So, for example, if you look at the conduit system, As far as I understand it, you have like a 24 refresh rate, 24-hour refresh rate on your conduit energy, and you can use a conduit energy to change specs. Essentially, you have like special abilities or something, and you can kind of switch them, and whatever wing you pick is like what spec you're going to be. So, whether you want to be a fire mage or a frost mage, you're going to have to wait basically 24 hours to switch. Now, in theory, if you were sitting around a meeting and you were like, well, these raids are too easy because players can just switch specs based on the boss and the mechanics that they need. So to make it a little bit harder, we could always make it so that you can't switch your spec in raid. So, discussions happen and we end up getting the conduit system. Well, when you actually play it, it's real bad, right? Again, from my understanding, and even just thinking about it, like in Final Fantasy XIV, if I had to wait 24 hours to switch jobs, dude, that would ruin the experience. Like, the whole point is that you can change jobs or change specs to be better equipped to beat the boss. Now, if you want to make boss mechanics that are, makes certain jobs, certain specs not as good, fine. But to take away flexibility of your character, in theory, that sounds way better than it actually plays out, because the actual gameplay is horrible. And if you actually had people playing it who are working behind the scenes, it would make sense that they would probably understand that that's bad and revert it. But it seems like they're pretty steadfast in keeping it around, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Another thing is like this energy system that you get from mobile games, right? These systems where you gotta wait a certain amount of time before you come back and play the game. That sounds a little bit like conduits. But anyway, but if you want to play more, you can pay money. Now, obviously, this is a little bit different because it's monetized, right? So companies are trying to incentivize you to spend in their game. But it's still kind of the same thing. Like, if you understood how poor these mechanics are, you would think twice about putting them in it and try and keep players in your game. Like I said, obviously, two very different dynamics there. But this is the thing that feels really big, is that Yoshi-P, I don't know if he's actively incentivizing or telling his developers to play the game. I'm assuming, hopefully, that they would just want to play the game. But at the end of the day, I also understand that if you work on a game all day, or any project, right, you want to do it less when you go home. You don't want it to feel like work. So if you've been working on, Final Fantasy content all day, or even months, like these artists, they work on stuff for a long time. It's not like it takes them 20 minutes to get a model done. And then you come home and it's like, I don't want to see more Final Fantasy content. I understand that. But, even just understanding first impressions to a game, like when a player freshly logs in, are they getting blasted with, buy this in the store right now, it's going to be gone in a couple hours? Or are they just kind of welcomed in calmly, like, not even like when I log in, not even the first or second banners that scroll across the launcher are about the Mog Station. It's like the third or fourth. It eventually comes up, but it's not being pushed in your face. It's just like a lot of news, like log in, hey, come in. And this is the type of stuff that it really helps if your developers are actively playing, because they understand these minute details and, of course, the larger concepts that they need to adjust and how to better adjust them, because they know what the players are feeling and what exactly it is they're complaining about and how better to fix it. Moving on. You've mentioned before that when redesigning Final Fantasy XIV, you look to World of Warcraft as an example of a successful MMO. What aspects of the WoW model did you end up bringing to Final Fantasy XIV? If there was no World of Warcraft, which is a game we look to as great mentor of sorts and respect deeply, Final Fantasy XIV's strong recovery wouldn't have been possible. The original Final Fantasy XIV was a failure of unprecedented proportions, and I was entrusted with the duty of salvaging it. When taking the lead to relaunch a failed project, I don't think you can afford to have the type of game you'd like to create in mind as your motivation, or you'd like to create in mind, as your motivation. But I was playing World of Warcraft and used that as a form of study. I deployed what I'd learned through the various teams, and together we used that in development. We really didn't have the luxury of bringing our own likes and dislikes. The main thing was that I wanted the game to be more story-driven MMORPG. There was a strong influence from Final Fantasy XI behind this, but with this being a Final Fantasy game, a strong story was naturally a must. That decision wasn't due to my personal taste, but because of the titles standing in the Final Fantasy series. This is where I think the most important part of this interview is. So let's talk about the first part real quick. Obviously, this makes sense. When Square Enix has a game launch as poorly as the first Final Fantasy XIV did, you get real desperate. And you're no longer in a situation where you have the freedom to just make a game you want to play. You have to make a game that will make money and that will draw players to it. Now, obviously, that's the goal with any game, right? You never go into a game and be like, this is the game I want to play. No one's going to play it, but I'll make it. Maybe there's some indie developers that do that. But for the most part, when you're making a game like from Square Enix, that should not be the goal. You need to have a goal to make money. So there are certain things that you have to change how you want to do them. For example, in the original Final Fantasy XIV, they tried to make it all one world. That didn't work. So now we have these instance worlds. And honestly, it's not that bad. Does it really matter that you can't go from like, you know, the city to the next region without an instance? No, it's not the end of the world. It's not game breaking, but it's something that they wanted to do the first time around. It didn't work out perfectly. So, hey, we got to make these changes. At the end of the day, you are kind of slave to your employer. And when they say, hey, make a game that can make money, doesn't really matter if it looks pretty. You know, as a commercial producer, I completely understand that. There have been many projects that we have to kind of rush. And it's like, ooh, we could do this cool thing, but it might take like 6 hours to do it. And they're like, yeah, well, we have 10. So, yeah, you got to scrap that and do something that happens a lot faster. So I understand the downsides of being in those situations, but it's the second point that I think is so important to the success of Final Fantasy XIV. The main thing was that I wanted the game to be more story-driven MMORPG. I think somewhere along the way, MMORPGs lost the fact that they are RPGs. And they started just becoming MMO games, just massive multiplayer online, but without the actual role-playing aspect. And I'm not talking you have to be there and be like, oh, we're going to destroy... I don't know what accent that was. I'm going to stop that. But, you know, like, the actual role-playing aspect. You know, we know these players who just sit in their cities, talk to each other in character. That's not the role-playing I mean. But from, you know, things that I've heard from the WoW community is that when you're actually going through and playing in the world, you don't feel like the hero of the story. You just feel like a hero in the story. So whenever you go around your questing, you're just given these giant walls of text to read. Whenever there's a big story point, it's Jaina or, Sylvanas or whoever it is. I don't know what the current story is, but basically it's them interacting, whereas you're just kind of there on the sidelines and you happen to be there. Final Fantasy Online, or Final Fantasy XIV Online, took that in a different route and made you the champion of the story, but not only made you the champion of the story, actually made a story, and a cohesive one, and one that has purpose. You know, there's not a lot of just like fetch quests or, you know, go wrangle up these sheep. Why? I don't know, because I don't want to do it. You know, like all the quests have some kind of meaning, and they, well, at least for the main story quest, right? Obviously there are side quests, but these quests all like have you as the central plot. And there's also like dialogue between you and NPCs, and you're very important to the story. You know, so the other day I was working on some glamours and I found a jacket that I really liked. The problem was it wasn't really compatible with my character's hair because it kept clipping through the back because it had a high collar. So I was like, all right, that's fine. I'll just go change my hair. But when I was looking through all the hairstyles that I liked, I was kind of having some trouble. Not just in picking, but actually making the switch. And I was trying to think, like, why am I having this much trouble changing my character's hair? And I think a lot of it is that, like, for me, obviously the character doesn't represent me because my character's a girl. Yes, it's a cat girl, but, you know, it's not supposed to be me. But, like, she is a character in the world. Now, obviously people can get, you know, haircuts, change their hairstyle, diet, whatever. But I would feel like I couldn't like Fantasia my character and make her a different race, right? Because she is that character. And that's one of the big differences I've noticed. Like when I'm either watching World of Warcraft creators or when I was playing myself, it wasn't, this is my character. It was, oh, this is my warrior. This is my warlock. This is my demon hunter. You know, you don't hear, this is my gunbreaker. This is my black mage. This is my red mage. This is my ninja. It's like, no, this is my character. And a lot of that has to come to do with the fact that Final Fantasy XIV, you can play all the jobs on one character. So, you know, you don't have to reference it as like the class types. But even when I played World of Warcraft, there was not this heavy incentive on the character being like your own or even part of the world. It was just like, this is the avatar you play. But for a lot of players, like their Final Fantasy XIV characters are just that, like they're characters in the world that you don't want to change because you've been on this journey with them. And that's what I think is kind of being lost in the World of Warcrafts of the world, is they're very good with when it comes to gameplay, but when it comes to actual immersion and like story and emotion, Final Fantasy is just knocking it out of the park, man. I think that's really what it comes down to, is Final Fantasy just absolutely nailed the RPG element of MMO. And, you know, having the Final Fantasy, you know, tag next to it, maybe that's what sparked this being a more story-driven game, but that's certainly what's been carrying it. And I think as long as they continue to do that, they're going to be in like a really good standing. Let's continue on with the rest of this interview, and then we'll wrap it up. How much do you still look to your competitors for inspiration? Do you try to learn from other games inside and outside the MMO space, or do you try and forge your own path? I'm always keeping an eye on World of Warcraft, Diablo, and Overwatch, and that's because I'm a Blizzard fanboy. Everyone over at Blizzard has been really kind to us, and they've invited me to visit their studio on 3 or so occasions now. When I went in 2018, the main team joined me in a discussion about the development and operation process. They're also considerate, and I respect them deeply. There was much I learned from them, and I made sure to be completely frank when answering whatever questions they had for me. It really was a joy to learn that there are so many Warriors of Light in the WoW team. As you can imagine, I'm not solely focused on WoW. I also check the basic systems of MMORPGs launching around the world. I even have staff in charge of compiling information about them and reporting that to me. However, Final Fantasy XIV has always carved its own path. We sometimes worry about what direction to take in a few years' time. We have plans, but it goes without saying that the details of what we're considering are all top secret. Final Fantasy XIV has huge cross-market appeal. Do different audiences across the world have different expectations from the games they play, or do they expect different games from the developers based in the East or West? It goes without saying that there will be a certain degree of varying cultural preferences due to the different environments in which gamers are brought up. Despite that, through Final Fantasy XIV, I've had the opportunity to directly communicate with players across the globe, and I feel that there is essentially no difference in expectations. Everyone loves games, loves being part of a community, and wants amazing gameplay experiences. Being able to create entertaining titles that bring smiles to the faces of all gamers, including myself, as we play them together is what drives me. Why do you think that Western and Eastern MMOs vary so dramatically in their approach and style? There's no doubt about the difference in taste between the West, even between Europe and America, and Asia when it comes to graphics and characters. On the other hand, if you were to ask me whether there's a significant difference in the game design process, my personal viewpoint would be that it isn't so remarkable. I'm Japanese, but Final Fantasy XIV has been well received by players across the globe, and we don't develop it based on the taste of any region in particular. Community retention schemes differ greatly between Japan, China, and South Korea, so it's not even possible to treat East Asia as a single group. I think it's the right approach to simply create a game that everyone can enjoy. Yeah, that's the thing. Everyone can enjoy a story where you are the hero. You know, it's not based on these tropes. You know, they're different. In literature, there are different tropes, there are different hero stories, but at the end of the day, if you are your own hero, that's what everyone wants to be, right? Everyone wants to be the hero of their own story, and that's what Final Fantasy does. Rather than making you a hero in the story, you are a hero in your own story. And another thing, too, is that, now I'm putting my own spin on this. He in no way said this, but, you know, when Yoshi-P was talking about how he keeps tabs on other MMOs and keeps tabs on all of Blizzard's games, you know, when Final Fantasy XIV first came about, sure, he was going to use World of Warcraft as inspiration because back then, so this is what, when was it, 2014? No, 8 years ago. Oh boy, math, yeah, 2014, 2013. World of Warcraft was still very popular. I think that was, that would have been after Mists of Pandaria. I don't remember what was after Mist. Was it Not Shadowlands. Battle for Azeroth? No. I don't know. But anyway, point is, yeah, you could certainly look at World of Warcraft for inspiration. And I think anybody who's making a MMO right now should obviously be looking for World of Warcraft as inspiration. Does that mean you have to copy their systems? No. And this is where I'm taking what Yoshi-P says with a grain of salt, in that they're using World of Warcraft as inspiration. I almost think that they're using it as inspiration of what not to do, because there certainly seems to be some problems in the WoW community right now. I'm sure, obviously, I'm sure it's a vocal minority. I'm sure there are a lot more people who are just fine with the game the way it is and just want to play it and don't want to listen to, either content creators or wherever else you hear about World of Warcraft problems. I'm sure there are people who are just tired of hearing it, because the players that the things that people are complaining about affects is just like the top percentage, right? The people who just play for an hour a day and just kind of want a quest, they're probably not going to care about all the in-depth systems. And that's kind of why a game like Final Fantasy XIV works, is that it's not based on raids. It's not based on PvP. It's not based on a game like BDO where you have a crazy pay-to-win shop, right? You're just a part of this big world where if you want to take part in the story, cool. That's like the most major part. And then once you get to afterwards, if you just want to chill in the main city and wear the coolest glamour you can get, cool. And Yoshi-P is going to back you 100%. This is the guy who said that if you're getting burnt out on the game, take a break. Right? He was actively incentivizing you to go play other games, not his own game, because he knows, or maybe he hopes, that you're going to be brought back to the game eventually. But if you burn yourself out, you're not going to come back, right? You're going to have these negative thoughts about the game and you're not going to come back. But he's confident that if you take a break and come back, it's all going to be good. There's certain other games out there, well, let's just say, is World of Warcraft, right? They actively base whether a mechanic is good or not, or if players are having fun, based on the amount of time spent in game. This is not a good determining factor on whether something is fun. It's whether the players think it is fun. There are plenty of players who will metaphorically bang their head against a wall for hours and hours, but that doesn't mean they're having fun doing it. And so that's kind of the perspective that I get from Yoshi-P and his developers, that he wants his players to actively have fun. He wants his team to be working in game, or playing in game, so that they know the problems that players are having day to day, as well as week to week, month to month, and they can better learn how to adjust the game and fix it. And if there's a feature that players want, cool, they're going to bring it in, because they want the players to have the best experience they can have in the time they have it. So, I think that this interview is really important. Like I said, I think that this story element is one of the most important things to why Final Fantasy is starting to really... It's already been a success, but it's finding even more success and grabbing players from other MMOs and pulling them in. And I think that's one of the big reasons why, is that this is a game that you can craft to be your experience. And I think that's what players are looking for. We've had this whole reliving of the 80s, right? We had all the Stephen King stuff. We had Stranger Things. Things go in cycles, and MMOs are no different. So I think players are starting to want to see kind of a return to that. And maybe that's not the worst thing in the world. But guys, that's all I got for today. Please let me know down below in the comment section what you think about this article or about this interview, and what you think about the general points that I made throughout the video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you haven't already, do make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell. That way you never miss a video. Join our Discord. Link will be down in the description below. We are primarily Final Fantasy XIV based. However, we are open to all gamers alike. And do follow me on Twitch. I stream 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, twitch.tv/xjazzy. But guys, that's all I got for today. Let's jam again sometime. Hit it.